Well, I'm here today at the very impressive offices of the well-known hearing implant company Cochlear here on the campus of Macquarie University. And I'm speaking to the CEO of Cochlear, Dr. Chris Roberts. Chris, thanks very much for speaking to me today. And my first question to you is, how important is science and technology to a company like Cochlear?
It's the key to growth. I mean, science and technology, or specifically technological innovation, is key to growth of a country. It's key to growth of a company. Technological innovation restructures markets, for example. It's our lifeblood.
Chris, last year you gave the JJC Bradfield Lecture on the topic of innovation in Australian business, and you talked about the role and the development of science and technology. And I think your thesis in part was that scientific and technological progress has not always been smooth and linear.
Yes, actually, I would say what I spoke about was really how man's prosperity had evolved over thousands of years. And if you think about how the evolution of man's prosperity, it's really about two things. It's about the ability to specialise, to do something quite well, and to be able to exchange it for mutual gain. So you need these two things, specialisation and trade, exchange for mutual benefit. And the key thing is that it's technology and technological innovation that can be a major driver of that specialisation component. Now, if we go back to sort of hundreds of years, perhaps for the last maybe 400 years, we've seen an incredible contribution from really the advances of Western science, the development of Western science. And I sort of differentiate Western science there because I think that was really impacted by the concomitant development of technology. And there are some important lessons out of that, because if you think of science as knowledge and technology as the application of knowledge, it's very easy to think of it as a linear model. You develop some knowledge and then you apply it. But what we know from the history of science is that often the technology comes before the science, because you can build things from trial and error and things. And there were some great examples with, say, Copernicus might have suggested, hypothesised that the Earth revolved around the sun, which was blasphemy back in the 16th century. But it was Galileo, using the technology of the telescope, who was really able to demonstrate that that's the case.
And incidentally, I think one interesting implication for public policy was, you talked a bit about Galileo, and I think one of the points you were making was that there are forces in society which can hinder or obstruct scientific and technological progress.
Yeah, I think that is an important point, because if you see that the evolution of man's prosperity is really about specialisation and trade, and that innovation is an important part of that specialisation, actually the history of mankind is really about man's efforts to constrain prosperity, because innovation implies change, and often in change there's winners and losers. So you've got a whole lot of people that don't like that. And it's armies, it's bureaucrats, it's priests, it's kings, it's the ruling elite, it's right through society. And that, to me, is how you can interpret the history of mankind over thousands of years. It's all the things to impact, impede the development of prosperity. And the point is, it exists today. There's an incredible amount of obstacles to free trade. Let's not fool ourselves. It's not a free trade environment out there. And similarly, we impede ourselves with regulations that have these unintended consequences as well. Perhaps we'll come back to that later.
Well, maybe if I just pick up on that point, you talked a bit about the range of regulation that a company like Cochlear is subject to, and you had an interesting example of the way that the current regulatory framework actually can hold you back in entering some markets around the world.
Yes, that's right. Excuse me. I used the example of how we're regulated by the Therapeutic Goods Administration. And we manufacture an active implantable medical device, and that's regulated pretty much around the world. And in the US, it's the FDA, and in Europe, there's a particular active medical device CE mark that you have to get, and in Australia, we get a similar approval from the Therapeutic Goods Administration. But there's some particular quirks the way the regulation works in Australia that really puts us as a manufacturer in Australia at a significant disadvantage. So, for example, we've seen in the last 5 and 10 years significant developments in Asian countries, for example, and as they develop economically, they want to put their own regulatory regimen in, and often they want country of origin approval first. So they require Australian government approval before you can even apply for registration in those countries. We've also seen over perhaps the last 5 years an increasing length of time to get our regulatory approvals in Australia. And the consequence of that is not just that it takes longer for the Australians to get access to new technology. The consequence is that suddenly there's now 37 countries that get delayed in getting access to this product. And we had a very important product where we were approved in Europe 14 months before we were approved in Australia. And so we're at a significant disadvantage against our competitors. And it's not, the TGA are wonderful people and are hard working and things, but it's the framework in which they're working. I think the challenge for Cochlear as a manufacturer in Australia to say, is this likely to get worse? Are we likely to be able to reform the system to have sensible reforms? Or because because Cochlear is perhaps one of the only active implantable medical device manufacturers in Australia, who cares? But I use the TGA as regulation as, I think, a good example. Because it's not really, there's no ideology associated with it. It's just sort of some unintended consequences of some well-meaning regulations. I mean, I'm also frustrated with the way industrial relations have gone in Australia, so that the way we've re-regulated the labour market makes no sense if you believe in the future of improving productivity and the future of manufacturing in Australia and the future of business, etc. in Australia. But as soon as you start to get into the details of that, you sort of end up in politics and people argue about ideology and things. So it's sort of hard to sometimes have a mature discussion about industrial relations. But I think the TGA is a good one because it's not really about ideology.
Yeah, on that TGA example, when you explained that to me and as I was listening to you speak, what it made me think was that there's really been a failure in regulatory design, and that's really an accountability of politicians, frankly, like me. In other words, you've got a set of regulations which is primarily designed with a thought about the impact on the health of people domestically in Australia. And there's not been all that much thought given about how it then plays through to the export capacities of an Australian-based manufacturer in this field.
Correct, and I think it's also perhaps how medical devices might be different from pharmaceuticals.
Yep.
So pharmaceuticals are a compound, and if you go back and fundamentally change that compound, it's a brand new drug and you start again. And so the way we regulate it in Australia is basically a submission and you put in a full submission. But medical devices evolve. It's sort of continuous improvement. And if you look at the FDA situation in the US or the CE mark in Europe, there's scope in the way they regulate medical devices to be able to submit changes as opposed to a huge big submission for something new. The Australian situation isn't like that. So even if you do a change, you submit this big submission. So it's actually it's maybe seeing medical devices separate from pharmaceuticals. It's about understanding how other developed markets in the world regulate things and learn from that. I think there's also another interesting quirk in this regulation in Australia where there's a public good role of the regulators, and that public good role in, say, Europe is separated from the regulatory or licensing role. But in Australia, it's actually done by the TGA. Now, the challenge we face is the TGA is funded 100% by industry fees. There's not a dollar of taxpayers' money goes to that entity. But that entity has a public good role to play. So how does that, how do they balance up how much, what resources they put at the public good versus the regulatory stuff? So it's things like that. And look, it might, I'm getting into a bit of detail here, and it might sound terribly boring, and it's probably irrelevant to 99.9% of the population of Australia. But these are the things that we do have to solve if we want a vibrant industry in Australia.
Well, it seems to me the public policy question is, if you want to have more companies like Cochlear, which are very successful international exporters of technology developed and commercialised in Australia, then what are some of the blockers, and are there things that you can do to remove or reduce the impact of those blockers?
Correct.
Chris, I mentioned earlier that we're speaking today at your head office, which is here on the campus of Macquarie University in a very impressive new building. How important is it for a company like Cochlear to be located on a university campus? How important are those links between a business like yours and the higher education and research sector?
So it is wonderful what's been created out here on campus of Macquarie University. Cochlear sees technological innovation is the key driver of improvements and change and growth, and we're spending perhaps 15% of our revenues on research and development. But it's about making sure we're connecting with the right people and developing the right technologies and the right products and the right applications. And this issue of hearing is a very multidisciplinary area. So it's not just that you want to detect some auditory sensation, it's you want to take this and develop speech and language and communication, and you want to connect with people. So there's a whole lot of things going on here that is determined by the brain, not just what's happening in the periphery. So there's a lot of disciplines involved. So what we're doing here on campus with the university, and the university is doing, is creating this wonderful precinct that covers a broad range of disciplines related to hearing and what you do with hearing, including for the age. For example, we know now that hearing loss is an independent risk factor for cognitive decline for ageing. So associated with ageing. So actually one of the groups moving into this hearing hub is actually the ARC Centre of Excellence for Cognition and its disorders. So we've got a whole range of disciplines, multidisciplinary. The other important or the exciting feature of it is that the groups moving into the hearing precinct are by and large world class in terms of their competencies, and we shouldn't underestimate that. And it's something that I've really come to appreciate really through my job of doing extensive travel. I mean, 95% of Cochlear sales are outside Australia, and I spend a ridiculous amount of time on planes. But that does give me a perspective to see how things are done around the world. And I know the groups like the Shepherd Centre in Early Intervention, the clinical work done at SCIC, the Australian Hearing Service, that does the hearing aids and looks after the paediatric children and upgrades for cochlear implants in children. Excuse me, the quality of the research done by National Acoustics Laboratory. These groups are world class. So what's been created on campus here is world class competency and a broad range of disciplines that truly is unique in the world. And it's on campus at Macquarie University. The Hearing Hub building is about 50% occupied by groups from the university, like the Department of Audiology and Speech Language Science and the like, and the other half by government groups or NGOs, the Shepherd Centre and the like, not-for-profits associated with hearings.
And would you expect over time that there'll be additional commercialisation of the research that's being done by all of those people, either by Cochlear or by other companies?
I think there's lots of opportunities for that, absolutely.
Chris, how important is education? You spoke about this in your lecture last year, and you mentioned particularly the STEM subjects, science, technology, engineering and maths.
I think education is very, very key for the future of society, and it's not just education, it's what do we educate our people in, and we've got to have the appropriate emphasis on STEM broadly, science, technology, engineering, maths. It's not only STEM, we also need an appropriate focus on the humanities as well. We need to develop the art of discourse, of rhetoric. We've got to go back to maybe how the Greeks thought about rhetoric several thousand years ago, and we've lost some of that. We were very, very good at critical thinking, but for wicked problems, for very, very complex issues, those skills that you'd get from the humanities are very, very important. But I think STEM is critical, and if we're not careful, we're not graduating the numbers of engineers that we need, for example.
Chris, in your lecture last year, you mentioned a book which is a favourite of mine, Matt Ridley, The Rational Optimist. From what you've said about the role of science and technology, and of course from your work leading Cochlear, a company which delivers hearing implants to thousands of people and lets them hear when they otherwise wouldn't, can I conclude that you are an optimist about the role of science and technology in progress?
Well, I am an optimist, and maybe 2 points on that, Paul. The first is on Matt Ridley, who I think is a great author, and is the book The Rational Optimist is really a blast against the prevailing pessimism in the world. But to me, the interesting part about that book was really the discussion about how man's prosperity has evolved. I think it's a nice contemporary discussion of that. The reason that he's an optimist and I'm an optimist is there's a lot of the pessimism around is not justified. The alarmist view of anthropogenic global warming is nonsense. But there really are a lot of people who treat that almost like a religion, but you've got to be able to go back and have a discourse. You've got to be able to go back and look at the data. And when you go back and look at the data, including what might happen to Africa in the second part of this century, there are reasons to be optimistic. Now, there are a lot of hurdles too, and Africa isn't where Asia is today, but Africa could well be the Asia of the second half of this century, and I think it's quite important that we're open to those opportunities. I think the poverty is also an interesting one. I think it was the United Nations that set a goal of lifting so many people out of poverty in 25 years, which was to 2015. The world actually met that goal in 2008, but you don't hear about that because it's, So I think you need there's this challenge about sort of seeing a way through the future, which I think is leadership is around that, seeing the way through. But perhaps it's a little bit of epistemic arrogance. You overestimate what you know and you underestimate what you don't know. And to some degree, I think you have to have had that through evolution. Man has to have that through evolution, otherwise you wouldn't get out of bed in the morning.
It must be a feature of working in a business like yours where you are so powerfully and tangibly changing the lives of people for the better, as well as generating prosperity. That must be a business which tends you towards an optimistic mindset, although I'm sure there are plenty of day-to-day challenges as well.
Yeah, I think the thing as a business leader, you need a very, very high tolerance for bad news. But going back to your other point, Paul, about business and good, I think it's interesting to look at the success of Cochlear, and it wouldn't have happened without scientists and clinicians doing that wonderful research, but it also wouldn't have happened without an entity forming like Cochlear with a business purpose, with capital, and with functional activities, be it marketing and sales and manufacturing and finance and things, to go out and capture customers and doing it in a way that's sustainable. And it certainly, to me, has demonstrated the important role for entities like business. And I think it's a terrible shame that society doesn't embrace business to the level that it should. Business, the only way that Australia has a future is if we have a healthy business environment. It's businesses that create value for society. That doesn't mean we don't need government. We do need government. We need sensible regulation, and you need a social net, and you need society to do things, and you need a social cohesion and the like. But business is a critical portion of that. We will not have a prosperous future unless we have business. And I think too much of the political debate is about how you divide up the economic pie rather than how you grow the economic pie. And if you get a healthy business environment and you grow that economic pie, then how you cut it up is a lot easier exercise.
Terrific. Chris Roberts, thank you very much for speaking to me today.